From PoliticsPA, I'm Steve Ulrich. This is Voices of Reason. Just over a week ago, President Biden announced he would not seek re-election and endorsed Vice President Kamala Harris for the top of the Democratic ticket. What does that mean for the 2024 presidential race? We asked the man who created the 13 keys to the White House what that means for his model. We also spoke to two pollsters to help us understand what all has occurred over the last 14 days, from an attempted assassination to a new Democratic nominee for president. And will Pennsylvania Governor Josh Shapiro be on the ticket as a Democratic VP? Our roundtable discusses. All this and more today on Voices of Reason. It's my pleasure to welcome Dr. Allan Lichtman to our program. Lichtman is a distinguished professor of history at American University and specializes in modern American history and quantitative methods. A graduate of Brandeis, he received his PhD from Harvard University and has published 11 books and several hundred popular and scholarly articles. His prediction system, 13 Keys to the White House, has correctly predicted the popular vote outcomes in all but one of the presidential elections since 1984. Thank you for joining us today on Voices of Reason.
All right, I haven't done the popular vote recently because of New York and California piling up 5+ million popular votes for Democrats. So I only call winners.
Okay. What attracted you to prediction methodology?
I'd love to tell you I came about it by deep contemplation, by ruining my eyes in the archives. But if I were to say that, to quote the late, not so great Richard Nixon, that would be wrong. I came across the keys and prediction methods largely by accident. In 1981, I was a distinguished visiting scholar at Caltech in Southern California. And there I met the world's leading authority on earthquake prediction, Vladimir Kailis Borick from Moscow. And he suggested we collaborate. And being brilliant and foresightful, of course, I said, no. Earthquakes may be a big deal here in Southern California. I got to go back to Washington, D.C., where I teach at American University. Nobody cares about earthquakes there. He said, oh, no, I already solved earthquakes, right? Get this. In 1963, he was a member of the Soviet scientific delegation that came to D.C. under JFK and negotiated the most important treaty in the history of the world, the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty that kept us from poisoning our oceans, our atmosphere, and our soil. And he said, in Washington, he fell in love with politics and always wanted to use the methods of earthquake prediction to predict elections. He said, look, I live in the Soviet Union, elections, forget it. So believe it or not, we then became the odd couple of political research, reconceptualizing American presidential elections in earthquake terms. As stability, the White House party stays in power. Earthquake, the White House party is tossed out. We then used Kailis Borick's methods of pattern recognition to determine the patterns associated with stability and earthquake, looking at every election from the horse and buggy days of politics, the election of Abraham Lincoln in 1860, and no, I didn't know him, and all the way up to the election of Reagan in 1980. And that exercise led to the 13 keys to the White House, which gauge the strength and unity of the White House party, essentially that elections are votes up or down on the White House party, and the challengers have little to do with it. It also led to our 6-key decision rule. If 6 of the 13 keys, which are true-false questions, where an answer of true favors stability, if 6 answers are false, the White House party is a predicted loser.
So before we go into more on the keys, for those who aren't really on board with all the idea of what is political modeling? How's that differ from what most of us view right now when we look at polling, whether it's state or nationwide?
Yeah, political modeling is fundamentally different from polling. Polls are not predictors. They're snapshots, and they change unpredictably from time to time. And there's no way to verify a poll except by taking another poll because no one's voted yet. And then they got to guess who the likely voters are. Whereas models look at the underlying structure of elections and based on that structure, develop a set of criteria designed to predict whether there'll be, in my case, stability or earthquake.
Could you explain in a little detail the 13 keys? What do you look
Yes.
at, and then what obviously the signals that you're looking for?
Yeah. Uh, There's the mandate key based on midterm elections, incumbency, internal party contests for the White House party, third party, uh, short and long-term economy, policy change, social unrest, scandal, foreign/military failure, and success, and only two keys have anything to do with the candidates, and they're very high threshold keys. They ask whether the incumbent party candidate is one of those once in a generation, truly inspirational conversion type candidates like Franklin Roosevelt or Ronald Reagan. Then they ask whether the challenging party candidate does not fulfill that criteria. Remember, the keys are always phrased so an answer of true favors stability.
So, in a situation that we had last Sunday when President Biden decided to not seek reelection, but certainly has a vice president now who seems to be the presumptive nominee, that still doesn't tip the incumbency key toward the Democrats. That would be read as false, correct?
Yes, that has implications on the keys, but not as dire as it would be if we listen to the journalists and the pundits and the operatives who have zero track record in predicting elections, who want the Democrats to have this big open new primary and party fight. Uh, Biden, by withdrawing, cost the Democrats the incumbency key. But by endorsing Harris and avoiding a primary fight, he salvages for the Democrats the contest key, thus making it easier for the Democrats to win. By the way, when the White House party has lost both the incumbency and the contest key since 1900, they have never won re-election.
So we've already established two of the 13 keys are split right now, one and one. Are you seeing any signs that are tipping the scale for a true false reading on any of the other 11, or is it still a little early for that?
I haven't made a final prediction, but I have said a lot would have to go wrong for the Democrats to lose. Let me explain. With Harris as the consensus nominee, the Democrats are now down three keys. Mandate key because of midterm losses in US House elections, incumbent charisma because Harris is not an FDR, and of course, incumbency. There are four remaining shaky keys. And the reason I say a lot would have to go wrong for the Democrats to lose is three of those four would have to fall. And they are third party, will RFK Jr. stabilize at around 10%? I don't think that's very likely, but possible. Social unrest, would there be another 1968 explosion at the Democratic Convention? Possibly. I don't think that's very likely. Foreign military failure, that one probably leans against the Democrats given what's going on in Gaza and Ukraine. Foreign/military success, still up in the air. And maybe Biden could achieve it if he, against all odds, brokers a ceasefire and hostage release in the Middle East.
Certainly, right now in Pennsylvania, all eyes are on Vice President Harris's selection for who she wants to be as her running mate. And the Keystone State Governor Josh Shapiro certainly seems to be on the short list. Anything in your methodology that indicates that a selection of a vice president has much impact on the actual outcome of the race?
There's always a lot of attention given to the selection of a vice president, but I don't have a vice presidential key because there's no evidence that it affects the outcome. In 1988, you may recall, you're not as old as me, but you probably remember 1988. Remember when H.W. Bush picked Dan Quayle, the lightly regarded Dan Quayle, and people said, oh my God, he sunk his election. And
Right.
Quayle suffered the worst humiliation in any debate, presidential or vice presidential,
That's
when he
right.
compared himself to John F. Kennedy. And, his veteran opponent, Lloyd Benson, said, Sir, I knew John F. Kennedy. He was a friend of mine. And you, sir, are no John Kennedy. Didn't matter. Bush won going away.
You had mentioned about how early on in our conversation about the popular vote versus the electoral college winner.
Yes.
How have you come around? You mentioned that I guess the populations in both California and New York have
Yes.
kind of thrown the keys into flux because of that.
Yes. When I first developed the keys, there was no daylight between the popular vote and the electoral college vote. You got to go all the way back to the 19th century to find the disparity. But now, of course, because of New York and California piling up 5 million plus votes for the Democrats with no comparable states for the Republicans, the popular vote has largely become irrelevant, which is why I only call winners. In the last 30 years, Republicans have won the popular vote exactly once in 2004 and then barely.
You've done a lot of scholarly work on quantitative methods, yet you have a lot of people that will look at prediction markets right now, whether it's predicted or some poly market or something like that. Uh, what do you think of those as, well, I guess I should say predictors?
They're not really predictors when you think about it because they're not models. They're just kind of a polling, in this case, a polling of a unscientific sample of people willing to put their money down on the election. And of course, they were cost a lot of people a lot of money in 2016 when I correctly predicted a Trump win, which did not make me very popular in 90% plus Democratic Washington, D.C., where I teach at
Sure.
American University.
So, why do you think, I've seen some of your read some of your work and seen some of your pieces, and you do not seem to be a fan of polling. As you said, it is a snapshot in time, but why are we so attracted to polls? Why are we so attracted to the horse race, do you think?
Do you want the short answer or the deeper answer?
I'd love the deeper answer.
All right, here's the deeper answer. You don't remember this, but I do. Dwight Eisenhower's 1961 farewell address, when he warned against the grip of the military industrial complex on America, sustained by an iron triangle. At one point, the contractors who make huge money. Another point, the military that gets all their hardware. Third point, the politicians who want military contracts in their states and districts. I've developed the idea of the political industrial complex, which locks us into this horse race, poll driven view of elections through its own iron triangle. One point are the consultants, the handlers, the ad men, the pollsters, who make huge money from the horse race theory of elections. Then another point is the media, who has to cover the election every day and thus has to buy into the horse race gauged by the polls. And then at the third point are the politicians who are afraid to go against the pollsters, the pundits, and the media. And I've been screaming for years that if we look at elections according to the keys, we can break through all this because the keys suggest it is governance, not campaigning, that counts, and that we should look at substance, not the froth of the campaign. The other important point is polls are far less accurate than they would have you believe. They tell you, right? You've heard this. The error margin is plus and minus 3%, right? That's pure statistical error. As a statistical expert, I know about this. That's the error you would get if you had a huge jar of green and red balls and you pulled a sample and you estimated the percentage of green and red balls in the sample. But human beings are not green and red balls. They lie to pollsters. They don't respond. They haven't focused yet on the election. They may change their minds. And no one's voted yet. So the pollsters have to guess at who the likely voters are. And that means the error is much larger and it's not random, it's directional. So in 2016, the pollsters underestimated Republican voting strength. And of course, like generals fighting the last war, they tried to correct that. And now, based on elections from 2022 to the specials of 2024, the pollsters are underestimating Democratic voting strength.
So as most attention begins on the presidential race for regular people, I guess, that don't study this, it starts after Labor Day. When would we be able to expect you to be able to navigate the keys and make your final call?
Yes, I've said no later than right after the Democratic convention, which I think ends August 22nd. So we're talking maybe a shade under a month from now for a final call. But keep in mind, I've said a lot would have to go wrong for the Democrats to lose. And I've been saying this for many, many months, even when all the pollsters were saying the Democrats are finished, the swing state polls, oh my God, pull my hair. The same thing they were saying about Donald Trump in 2016.
Right.
Oh, can I say one more thing?
Please do.
If you want to follow my analysis and the keys, my son Sam and I have a live show on YouTube every Tuesday and Thursday at 9 p.m. Eastern, and you could find it at Allan Lichtman YouTube, ALLANLICHTMAN YouTube. And my new book is out, Predicting the Next President 2024, available on Amazon.
Thank you very much again for the time today. We enjoyed having Dr. Allan Lichtman with us on Voices of Reason. We'll be right back. An attempted assassination of former President Donald Trump. The Republican National Convention. President Joe Biden announces he won't seek a second term. VP Kamala Harris becomes the presumptive presidential nominee on the Democratic ticket, and Josh Shapiro appears to be a frontrunner to become Harris's running mate. All this has occurred in the last 10 days. Who better to put it all in perspective than our friends Chris Borick, professor of political science at Muhlenberg College in Allentown, and Berwood Yost, director of the Floyd Institute for Public Policy at Franklin Marshall College in Lancaster. Gentlemen, welcome.
Steve?
Thanks, Steve. It's a pleasure.
Why don't we start by discussing the events that unfolded in Butler 2 weekends ago and the impact that had on the presidential race and the RNC convention that took place in Milwaukee. I'll start with you, Berwood.
Well, I was actually having this conversation with someone the other day, and that it would be easier to know the effects of these things if there was more time between them, honestly. They all kind of get collapsed together, and it makes it very hard to disaggregate the effect of any one thing, based on the tools that we have, which are polls. And so I think there was certainly a change in tenor for a few days after the event. I think many people felt up through the closing night of the Republican convention that it was very successful. And it really seemed like one of the most pronounced effects that attempt had on Mr. Trump's life was that the party itself became a bit more unified. As some people who we might not have expected to speak before that attempt showed up at the convention and pledged to support the ticket. I'm thinking specifically of Nikki Haley, and I think Ron DeSantis as well. So, that particular event, in my mind, I think really helped the party itself come together and rally around President Trump.
Chris, did you get the sense that everyone in the Republican Party had become unified? They were enthusiastic. And then former President Trump gave his 93-minute speech and seemed to some observers kind of took the wind out of the sails, didn't it?
I have to agree, right? And I don't know how many people were still watching it. I, of course, doing what I do, watched it all late till almost midnight, whatever. It seemed very close by that point. Certainly, it wasn't a great convention speech. After I'll agree with Berwood, a really solid, orchestrated 4 days in Milwaukee in the wake of the tragic events that happened in Butler. It was about as good as you could want. I mean, conventions have largely become these staged media events now in American politics. They lack the drama that they once did. And so this one drew attention in midsummer in ways that you would never see. And I think some of the viewership numbers that I saw were pretty good for fragmented media market and events that lack drama, that build drama. And Steve, the at the end of it, it was not a good speech. It was long. You could see the reaction in the room, right? It's kind of deflating. People were checking their watches. They were ready to go. And this is for someone that, as Berwood was just talking about, had became a sympathetic figure, even for Republicans that like and are very strong supporters. Trump has a different kind of relationship, but in the wake of that assassination attempt, he became sympathetic and drew folks in that within his own party that certainly have not been close allies. And I think it was a wasted opportunity. And again, doesn't affect him. Berwood mentioned being able to uh, parse those things out is pretty hard. But it certainly didn't do him any favors.
Yeah. And I think we forget as well, Steve, that um, I mean, I agree completely with Chris's assessment there. I didn't think the speech was that effective. And it really seemed like heading into it, it might be, given, the kind of talk about unity and the sort of different tone that we thought might come out of that. And for the first few days, it seemed like maybe that was going to happen. I think the choice of J.D. Vance, though, as the presidential candidate, um, was was sort of a doubling down on Trumpism. It wasn't an effort, as you would traditionally see a president make, to kind of balance his weaknesses, like he did in 2016 with Mike Pence, right? Um, so, and I think that was largely because I think the president felt at the time, I think he was right, the former president felt he had a lot of momentum, including the event you didn't mention, which was the federal judge in Florida dismissing the documents case against him. I mean, all this stuff happened, and it all was, talk about wind at your back. That at that moment, and at the end of this convention, former President Trump really seemed to be in good shape.
And then 3 days later, for the first time since 1968, when LBJ decided not to seek a second term, President Biden made that announcement. Chris, I'll start with you. Were you surprised by the decision that Biden made? And were you surprised how long it took him to arrive at that decision?
Yeah, it's great questions, Steve. In the end, I wasn't all that surprised given the momentum, the data, the surging number of Democrats that were going to push for the president to step aside, and some polling, like Berwood. I'm a pollster, and I was looking at a lot of the polling evidence, post debate, which another landmark event this summer, and the direction of the race, and it was simply becoming untenable for the president, I believe, to continue and raise money and um, go into a convention in a unifying way. I think the so-called writing was on the wall, and the president made a good decision. I think a good value on my part for his legacy, for his party. It's never easy, right, to step aside from the highest position in politics and in the country, and maybe the most powerful position in the world. And he did. And we'll hear from him tonight. As he publicly states his reasoning and where he's at. And so the timing, I didn't know. I think we talked maybe through email recently, and I thought it'd probably become around beginning of the month in August that he's going to use these weeks to between the Republican convention and others. But I think it was clear, and that he found this the most convenient time to maybe a little political strategy too, right? Kind of this wave that Trump is running. Well, let's nip that in the bud with some other news. I think strategically it might have fit the bill.
I agree with that. It certainly seemed like it took a lot of the wind out of Republican sails coming out of the convention. Bob, your thoughts?
Well, right after the debate, I really thought, man, I don't think Biden's going to go anywhere. He's so defiant. But the pressure was intense. And I think what added to the intensity was the fact that the polls, which had been stable pretty much the entire race, all of a sudden were moving against him. And if you compare the 2020 polls over time with the current polls, I mean, Biden was in really bad shape. And the fundamentals of the race put him at a huge disadvantage. I mean, people just were not happy with his performance as president, and they're deeply concerned about his age, and the debate just reinforced that. And so, as his numbers sank, um, I just became inevitable that he was going to have to leave. And in fact, I think what really sealed the deal is that he was on the air advertising after the debate, pretty much in Pennsylvania and the other swing states, with almost no competition from Trump advertising. He was far outspending him. And he was doing all these media events and all these other campaign events, and he was still losing ground. I think that was the real impetus to say, whatever we've tried isn't working. And I think now, whether it was strategic or not, the timing, I'm surprised how quickly the Democrats have consolidated around a new candidate. There seems to be more energy now. I think I'm anxious to do my first poll, Steve, because I think the dynamics of support will look different. And at a minimum, what President Biden was having trouble with was his own base. And I think Kamala Harris brings that back. Now, can she go beyond that base? I don't know. But it's pretty fundamental to, I think, politics 101. You got to have your base before you can expand beyond it.
Well, because I want to talk to you both about the vice president slot, but when you look at the two key demographics, it seems for Democrats, you're talking about women, and then you're trying to draw young people into the fold, and it certainly seems like with the vice president becoming the presumptive nominee, you can almost check those two boxes as positives. Am I off base on that?
I think you're right on, Steve. Those are cornerstones for the modern Democratic successful coalition, presidential politics for certain. And I think this kind of builds on what Berwood was talking about. I think this is building, controlling your base, solidifying your base, is step one. This is great news for the Democrats on that front. We're going to talk about things gained, things lost from the change of candidates, and things gained. Right, Democratic coalitions, voters of color, particularly Black voters, are crucial. The most loyal group, kind of racial ethnic group among the Democratic coalition. This helps there. Biden's numbers and polling, I know Berwood's polls, our polls, other polls have shown struggles among voters of color and Black voters. This helps on that front. It helps among younger voters, where compared to traditional numbers for Democratic candidates, Biden was really at a deficit, an enormous gap. So those two groups, I think, are bolstered by the Harris campaign. You mentioned, of course, women. The women have broken for Democratic candidates for decades, and it's crucial to continue that. I think this only helps their case there. So those are all things gained, and the energy that comes with it, and the fundraising, and all the other things.
Can I hop on the gains before you go to the deficits?
Absolutely.
Yeah, let me just add, I do think that another gain is having a candidate who can articulate a case, and she has an argument for her candidacy, sort of a vision for the future, and a case to prosecute against Trump. And Joe Biden hasn't been effective doing any of those things. And so I think, you know, one of the benefits of the switch is you now have a more agile candidate who can offer a vision for the future, which is something I think was a real deficit for Biden. So that's another addition and to add on to what Chris says. So now, Chris, go back. Now what are the gaps?
No,
Sorry
I
to take
love.
your role, Steve. There you
No, don't. But that's actually a wonderful thought. It really does. We think about her connection to coalitions, but as a campaigner, right? She can. The president struggled mightily with doing that, right? And I think she brings a whole different skill set in that area. Her prosecutorial backgrounds, right? I think she's
Yes.
comfortable. So that's great. And so on all these metrics, I think it's a big positive move for Democrats. Back to the negatives is, will there be areas of the electorate that she doesn't mesh as easily with? And I say yes. In Pennsylvania, that even Biden in his weakened state continued to have some strengths in some older, whiter voters that were especially among Democrats or independents. He was maintaining a pretty good standing. That fit is not as natural. Obviously, realities of identity politics and connections and a whole array of factors are going to make that more challenging for Vice President Harris in Pennsylvania. I think about YouTube. I'm a Scranton boy. Biden was able to offset some of the Republican gains up there with his local identity and who he was. And it mattered. Everything matters in Pennsylvania. It's probably all of us think about that. Everything's on the margin. In the last election, I think it was key, right? That part of his winning coalition was to cut into places like that. That gets taken off the table immediately, right? And would I expect him, the vice president, to perform as well as Biden did in Lackawanna and Luzerne counties? The answer is no. And so you gain things, you lose things. Exactly where that comes out in the wash, right, is where all the speculation is now. And you need smarter people than me to tell you exactly where it is. Berwood, you could do that. You could figure it all, what it all means.
Well, I don't know that anyone's capable of that, because that's like three-dimensional chess. But I also, I'll just add, I think you're spot on that Biden retained some real strength with particularly white older voters that never went away. I'm wondering where those voters go. I think the perception may be that Kamala Harris is more progressive than moderate, and that's where Biden's real strength was among moderate voters. And so, can she wrestle that back or not? I think she's also really vulnerable on specific issues. I think she offers advantages talking about, say, abortion rights, and she has a message I think that works there. But she's vulnerable, I think, on immigration. She's vulnerable on fracking, which, I mean, that's an important thing to talk about in this state. So it will be curious to see how the coalition has shifted. And I think Chris is absolutely right. Some of those white working class communities, she's just not going to do as well as Biden. But I think on the flip side, the turnout in Philadelphia and Pittsburgh is probably going to be better than it was. I mean, let's face it, I think 60% of voters said they didn't want either of these candidates running. They wish there was a change. Many of them think they're both too old. So Nikki Haley even said that whichever party dumps their 80-year-old candidate is going to win. So now she obviously had a vested interest in saying that, but I think from my perspective, it makes what was a really boring race among candidates that a lot of people weren't excited about. it sort of changes that dynamic, which is interesting.
So now the Republicans have added J.D. Vance to the ticket, and Kamala Harris searches the countryside looking for her running mate. A few names that pop to mind: Senator Mark Kelly out of Arizona, Governor Roy Cooper from North Carolina, and certainly Pennsylvania Governor Josh Shapiro. Uh, Oftentimes, when you look back through history, a vice presidential selection doesn't really have that kind of impact. But by the same token, I'm guessing this is one of the first times you've ever had perhaps the most important state, being Pennsylvania, have someone that might be able to fill in that second command role. Your thoughts on Josh Shapiro and the possibility of him being added to the Democratic ticket?
I love the question. You think historically, Berwood was talking a little bit, about the strategy of how you pick folks and what doesn't matter, and when historians think about vice presidents that might have mattered, the one that comes to mind is Lyndon Johnson in 1960, right, with Texas, which is a whole story, and we have to talk about that race, which I'd love to. But ultimately, he was picked because Democrats needed Texas. And he jumped on after, by the way, it's kind of fun to think about candidates deciding if they want to put themselves. Traditionally, it's not a coveted spot, right? The vice presidency. Burrow and I were joking a few days about quotes about the office and how it's not viewed very positively by individuals. And Johnson really was kind of like him and Hahn, powerful member of the Senate, moving to vice president is not usually the move you'd want to make. And there was no one more powerful than Johnson. And now you got Bush Shapiro, right? Obviously, we're so interested in Pennsylvania with our governor. A popular governor of one of the biggest states with a rising political star. You could absolutely see why Democrats would covet him, and Vice President Harris as a running mate. He's as good of a candidate as you'll ever find, I think, for this position. And I would be beating his door down trying to get him on the ticket. I think he would have to weigh what Lyndon Johnson did all those years ago. Do you step aside from a position of power to take a second position on a ticket with uncertain outcomes ahead of you? I, my traditional instinct is probably not. People have convinced me, are trying to convince me others. And then again, only, of course, the governor can decide on what his motives are. If his motives are strategic, I think it might be good to pass. If his motives are, I could help the party, a la LBJ in 1960, maybe he says, I got to take this one for the team. I could help in Pennsylvania, and I think he could help in Pennsylvania, very much so. So it's fascinating to watch.
Yeah, I'm with you, and I like that way of thinking about it. What's more important for Governor Shapiro? The immediacy of the race and maybe helping win, or longer term career plans, and only he can answer that. I think he'd be a great choice, in part because what we talked about earlier. It would signal um, Kamala Harris's interest in a more moderate perspective, right? It signals her intent to include that kind of thinking in her brain trust, so to speak. So from that standpoint, I think a really helpful um, pick for her. Pennsylvania is an important state, and I think, um, a la Johnson in 1960, maybe he can help her carry this state if he were on the ticket. I mean, he's undoubtedly the most popular statewide politician we have. Um, and so I think he could help. He could help appeal to those white working class voters, where everybody talks about Fetterman's success with those voters in 2022. Well, Shapiro's success was even greater. So, um, I think that makes him a good pick. What also makes him a good pick compared to, say, someone like Mark Kelly is you don't have to burn a Democratic senator to do it, right? I mean, the balance of the Senate, that's in play, and why would you mess with that? Um, and I guess the last thing, though, I would add, not to kind of uh, pour any water on this, but you know, with what we had previously talked about in terms of the change in who Harris attracts to the ticket, I think it's likely that maybe Pennsylvania isn't as important for her candidacy as it was for Biden's. It was becoming very clear that Biden was not going to win Georgia or maybe Nevada or maybe Arizona, that his pathway pretty much remained the I hate when people call us the Midwest, but that's what everybody says. The Midwest, Pennsylvania, Michigan,
Ever since the
Wisconsin.
Pirates moved to the NL Central, we've been in the Midwest.
That's probably why. That's a good point. I hadn't thought that was
All right,
why.
Steve.
Yeah, very, very smart analysis, Steve. So
We lost a great rivalry, but anyway, I digress.
we did. But I mean, but the bigger point is with this reassembled Democratic coalition, um, I think Georgia, Arizona, Nevada, all of a sudden become a possibility that they weren't when Biden was on the ticket. And so if they're the possibility, maybe some of these Midwestern states um, will become less important. I mean, certainly you want them. And I think Pennsylvania is vital. But I also think there's pathways now that didn't exist for Biden.
As we sit back now with bated breath, waiting for the next polls to come out from both Muhlenberg and Franklin and Marshall, a lot of people are turning their attention to the modeling um, that we've seen, whether it's done through 538. You have Dr. Allan Lichtman with his 13 keys to the White House. You see the predictive markets that are out there. Just as pollsters, what are your thoughts with some of the other ways that people are getting their information about who leads the horse race?
Uh, I'm interested in them all. All right, I'm as like Berwood. I'm a pollster. I'm a big fan of that methodological approach to gauging where an electorate is at, and with all its pros and cons and challenges. I'm still all aboard there. But I also, like other measures, I like to see. I think things like markets have fascinating predictive value and should be looked at. I like a lot of the metrics people might apply with media use and engagement. I think have value. The Lichtman type models. I'm interested. I look at them. I look at their track record. I do always, where Berwood and I are quantitative folks. Small samples always scare me, and so if you get a method that happens to work for 12 out of 13 times, you say, "Look how good it is." I go, "Well, oh yeah, of course." I mean, it's worked in these situations, but that's why presidential studies and politics are so hard. The sample size is small. We haven't had a bunch of presidents, so they're fascinating. They're interesting. The dynamics they use, the measures they use. Am I always sold on them, even if they've had some good success rates? No, but doesn't mean I won't check in on them because I think they're fact.
I'm with Chris. I mean, I think polls are really valuable for understanding the context of a race. Um, Polls really don't predict. Modelers predict. If you're predicting from a poll, you're building a model that suggests the things that are important. So it's important to keep those things separate. But like Chris, I'm all about multiple sources of information to help you understand. And there's a term for that in research. When I teach my students about research methods, we talk a lot about triangulation. And the idea behind triangulation is that you use different methods to understand something because those different methods have different strengths and weaknesses. And then taken together, they paint a clearer picture. And so I love the other models. I think it's interesting the things that they think matter and the way they assess those things. I mean, that's all really interesting. So why not use it all? I mean, the more data, the better. By the way, 538's prediction model is currently suspended, I believe, giving us the sign of the time.
I did check that out the other day, and I saw the big red letters across the screen. Um, will we be able to see new polls coming from the two of you coming out mid-August? I don't want to give away state secrets if they are. Maybe the surveys are already out in the field.
For us, we're going to do. We've built our poll. Actually, we had 2 polls. I mean, our plan has been to go out into the field the first week of August, and given the uncertainty, we wrote 1 poll if Biden stayed in and 1 poll if he dropped out. So since he's dropped out, we've polished up that other one, and our plan is to go into the field around the first full week of August and report the following week and see what we get. Who knows what might happen? I mean, so the last poll we did in June was we did a congressional district, and the Trump verdict came at the halfway point of that poll, we saw the numbers change as a result of that verdict. So it was really interesting. I'm hoping something like that doesn't happen. I hope we get a clear read, but that's currently our plan.
I'm afraid, like Berwood too, with all these intervening effects, right? We were doing, it was more for a client, one during the debate period, and it was like when the debate happened, there were some political things in there. I was going, oh, well, we got a natural experiment to look at for pre-post debate, which is fun for us, but not necessarily good to make kind of generalized findings from a fielding. We're gonna be heading in the field probably sometime in August, and then all the way through the fall, right? Like Berwood, we're going to be doing the 2 or 3 statewide polls. We're going to focus on the 7th congressional district up here.
Right.
This is Miles district, which is a good one. I know Berwood down the 10th district, the 8th districts. There's a bunch of good districts in Pennsylvania to look at. So hopefully I'll actually talk with Berwood, maybe make sure we're covering enough of them together to do. So we're not replicating.
I'm glad you brought that up, because I think back to our earlier point of conversation about Biden dropping out, as his numbers started to sag, it was concerns about Congress, the Senate, and some of these state houses that what I think were part of the motivation here, because there are models. Speaking of models, if there's a uniform swing of 3 or 4 points towards Republicans compared to, say, 2020, I mean, what's the consequence of that in House races? It turns a potential Democratic advantage into maybe a sizable Republican advantage. I mean, if Trump were to carry the United States by 3 to 5 points, all of a sudden you're talking about pretty good gains in the House for Republicans. And I think we didn't talk about that as another pressure point, but I think there were a lot of members of Congress in a district like a Susan Wild's district. Northampton County is a swingy place. And they're thinking, oh no, if he loses Pennsylvania by 4 points, I'm toast. And I think that was part of not to take us backwards, but I think that was an important thing to keep in mind too about the pressure.
A dizzying news cycle, and I have 2 guys that helped us see through it all. Chris Borick, professor of political science at Muhlenberg, Berwood Yost, director of the Floyd Institute at Franklin and Marshall. Gentlemen, thank you once again for joining us on Voices of Reason.
Hey, thanks, Steve.
Go Phillies.
Yep, go Phils. See you, Chris.
Welcome back to the Voices of Reason Roundtable. We're joined today by Guy Ciarrocchi, the senior fellow at the Commonwealth Foundation, Charles McElwee, the founding editor of RealClearPennsylvania, Liz Preet-Havey, partner with Dilworth Paxton Law Firm, and Todd Shepherd, the investigative reporter with Broad and Liberty. And Guy, let me start with you. It's been such a dizzying 2 weeks, everything that has happened. Can you give us a quick review of the Republican National Convention and the good feelings that came out of Milwaukee?
Yes, in a sense, we feel like that happened a year ago, right? It was big news. Look, my approach to either party's convention is, the old-fashioned first rule of thumb: do no harm. And they did no harm. In fact, I think even to objective observers, it was well run. Each night had a theme. Anybody who was even half paying attention recognized the theme, from law and order to the men and women who serve us as first responders, the men and women who serve us in the military, those who gave their lives. J.D. Vance's speech was short and to the point. You know, the takeaway was he was a non-politician, became a politician. It's a rags to riches story, the American dream. President Trump's speech was focused. It was long, but again, only folks like us watched or listened to the whole thing. I think he came across as genuine and sincere. So rule one, do no harm. They checked that box. And two, I think they echoed their themes, and President Trump did well, and it was a slightly different, softer side. So it was a net plus that I think achieved everything they hoped for. But because of the world we live in, Steve, as you said, the focus on what was a successful convention perhaps stayed front of mind just for a couple of days because the news of the day kept changing. But otherwise, they did their job for that moment in time.
Charles, what were your takeaways from Milwaukee?
Well, as Guy noted, that feels like a very long time ago, but there was no harm in the sense of so much has happened since then that it's a very distant memory. But Trump's speech, first 30 minutes or so, it was a somber tone, and then it transitioned to a speech that, if you talk to most voters, as I have in recent weeks, the takeaway was that it was too long and that most people went to bed by midnight. But he has since talked about Bitcoin. He's talked about Christianity. He's working so many different groups since then that, again, that's a memory too. A memorable moment was the Teamsters president, Sean O'Brien, speaking at the convention. And it's reflective of this political realignment that we're seeing, that workers and unions, labor unions, are more open to the Republican Party. It will be interesting to see what that means for a state like Pennsylvania and how Republicans campaign among union workers who may be sympathetic to the GOP, because let's not forget, warehousing is a massive employment sector in the state. And let's say there's a scenario like Amazon fulfillment centers, workers who want to unionize. Will Republican candidates be cornered in those scenarios now that the Teamsters union president, scenarios like that, officials like that who are now sympathetic to the GOP, what does that mean for the realignment?
3 days after Milwaukee concludes, on Twitter, Joe Biden announces that he's not going to seek re-election for a second term. A couple of days later, Kamala Harris, vice president, seems to ascend to the top of the ticket. Todd, kind of a dizzying cycle once again. Your takeaways from the move by the Democrats?
Well, I think probably most of the people on this panel would agree that it was a long overdue move, and that every day that they could have moved that forward would have benefited them even more. So it's a wonder that it happened so long. To pack in, look, we normally talk about Labor Day setting the starting point of a presidential race or that cycle, right? And now you have a summer in which you had two of the craziest events you could possibly have within a 10-day period, where you have a failed assassination attempt, and then you have the incumbent presumptive nominee dropping out, and then giving an endorsement to his vice president, which theoretically still leaves it open for a contest, but doesn't really leave it open for a contest. So, in terms of what should be happening in a presidential contest in July, this is the craziest July you've seen in a century. That's hands down it. And so, look, we all know that because we've all just lived through it, right? But that just underscores how, look, if we're all feeling it just as average voters, think about what the average paid analyst or the average paid campaign strategist or campaign manager is dealing with, even if they run something like a state rep or a state senate campaign in Pennsylvania.
Liz, as a former election director, I know how difficult it would have been to conduct a mini primary. A lot of folks were saying that if you're going to have Kamala Harris at the top of the ticket, she should at least face maybe a challenge in a mini primary. Were you surprised that Democrats seemed to coalesce around her as quickly as they did?
I'm not. The reason being, I don't think they had any choice. This was, in my view, if to step over her would have created a huge, I think, many years long pain for the Democratic Party. So I thought that it would definitely be Kamala. Um, I think that she already had an operation. There was all these pluses that people were talking about why it should be her. The campaign was set. Her people were in place. Biden's people were in place. The message was set, and she just needed to go out and give a speech. I know she's getting some credit for launching so well, but the reality was it was launched. It was already ready. The same people, the money was there, and she just needed to get out there and give a nice speech, which she did. So no, I'm not surprised. I will be surprised if she's able to anoint a vice president without any feedback. If everybody's so united that they just immediately glom to whoever she picks, that will be a little surprising.
I certainly want to talk about that in a few moments. Guy, I know one of the things that was discussed about keeping Harris at the top of the ticket was the $93 million that the Biden-Harris campaign already had in the bank. That would not have necessarily gone to another Democratic candidate. Did that seem to you one of the reasons as well?
Yes, but we're now in an era of monopoly money. We're now in an era of super PACs where people write checks that are 7, 8, or 9 figures. So, look, if you and I were going to put together a campaign and somebody said, "Here's $93 million in seed money," we'd be very happy. But now that presidential campaigns are sometimes approaching billion-dollar operations, I think Liz's points are far more relevant. You have a sitting vice president that we all have to recognize without getting into the partisanship and the name calling, but she's a female minority race, sitting incumbent vice president. For the Democratic Party to it would have taken a concerted effort to push her aside, which would have appeared to everybody in the United States as though they were pushing her aside. I think that pie was baked. The money's part of it, but to Liz's point, it's also the practical. The apparatus was there, the message was there, the slogans was there, all of the impetus. But I also think, particularly at this moment in time for the Democratic Party, given how they've focused their issues, pushing aside, a racial minority female incumbent vice president was not going to happen. And frankly, most Democrats, whether the voters agree is another story, but most Democrats are happy with that record and think they can win with their record. So you just switch out the candidates. It's sort of plug and play, and that was the easiest way to just do plug and play.
Charles, it seemed like Republicans came out of Milwaukee with all the momentum, and seemingly Democrats have stolen it away. What's your sense on the state of the race right now?
The state of the race, some polling, it's early. We may not have clarity until around Labor Day, into early fall. Some polling suggests that voters are aligned on either where they were before the switch to Kamala. But the momentum clearly when it comes to the press, the rollout of Kamala's candidacy, the enthusiasm is on her side right now. But there are still demographic trends that indicate that this is still a race, whether it's young men under 30 who are breaking toward the GOP, but conversely, young women under age 30 are pushing toward the Democratic Party more so than recent cycles. Other questions still hold. Where does the Latino vote hold when it comes to enthusiasm for Trump? Does that remain the case? So it's too early to say, but the underlying issues in this campaign, whether it's the economy or immigration, those are pre-existing conditions and they remain the top concerns. And therefore, although there's this honeymoon period for Kamala, there's no doubt that this is still a race.
Todd, as we've talked about many times on this podcast, polls are just a snapshot in time. So is it way too early to be reading anything into these? What is your take on the state of the race?
Yeah, it absolutely is way too. I think Charles is right. There's a lot of consolidation that has to happen. Obviously, there's going to be a lot of initial enthusiasm around the new candidate, out of a sense of rallying, of party loyalty rallying. And I think look, we all know that, Guy was talking about plug and play with the same administration before, and he's right. But I still think there is the question of how well the Trump campaign can maybe pivot to some sharper attacks on Vice President Harris that maybe haven't been tested in some other ways. Like, one thing that comes to mind is, we all know she was a prosecutor in San Francisco, but she also, at one point, she was a guest on The Breakfast Club, a morning radio show in New York City, and she made this flippant remark there that she had tried marijuana and she had inhaled, and this has, caused a lot of people to say this is this shows her hypocrisy, and really kind of her out of touch with this whole movement over the last decade that marijuana has been used unfairly, for decades, as a punishment tool, as an incarceration tool, a mass incarceration tool against Black America. And so, what could the effects of sharper ads against the candidate like that be? So there's an awful lot of settling to be done. And I even think that some of that comes to still some realignment with some of the other down ballot candidates. Look, Bob Casey was really holding on to President Biden until the last minute. And obviously he's been very enthusiastic for Vice President Harris now. But still, I think there's even got to be some readjustment in the messaging, even in the down ballot tickets.
Liz, let me follow up on Todd's comment about the U.S. Senate race. Does this have any impact for Dave McCormick in particular as he contends for Bob Casey's seat?
I think it does, because I think that there's now, I think the Democrats are going to have a huge turnout problem. And I don't see that. I think when you were looking at polls, you had to remember that they were polling based on turnout in the last election. And I just don't think the Democrats were going to get to that turnout. Now I think they probably will. And so, it's going to make it a little bit more difficult for everybody, not only for Trump, but all the way on down.
Every 4 years, American political types have a case of amnesia when it comes to the impact on the vice presidential selection. And this seems to be the case once again, as we all circle around wondering about the impact of who Kamala Harris would select or who Donald Trump selected, without getting into who J.D. Vance or who the Dems could possibly pick. Guy, I'll start with you. What's your take on the impact of the second line of the ticket for any presidential race?
So I'll go back to a recurring theme as we talk about presidential races. First one is do no harm, right? You need to pick someone that either voters are excited about, or frankly, they go, who? What you don't want as a presidential nominee is to pick someone who a large segment of the nation goes, oh my God, right? Most people didn't know who Mike Pence was, but at the end of the day, I don't mean any disrespect to him, but he looked like a middle America safe guy. He was a guy in a suit. He had been a governor. You're like, okay, he like, heaven forbid something happens, he could be president. So your first rule of thumb is don't make a mistake. Don't so shock the voters with somebody that's untested or is going to do something crazy. The only reason I think in modern politics that it has some impact is that our last several elections have been so close, and that anything matters. And I don't know that anyone that Vice President Harris could pick that's going to move the needle nationally. And I don't know that she has to. One of the reasons talking about people in certain states, whether it's Governor Shapiro or others, is that you're in such a tight race that you're looking to move the needle 1 or 2 points in one state. So it's not so much, gee, who can rally 10 states or 5 states? I mean, even J.D. Vance, they're talking about him basically spending all of his time in 3 or 4 states. I think that Vice President Harris may follow a similar model, whether it's a senator from Arizona, a governor from Pennsylvania, or governor of North Carolina. I think that person's going to have one mission: flip 8 to 10 electoral votes. And I imagine that's what's going on. So I think the old model that we're all used to is gone. It's now 1, do no harm, and 2, can you protect or give me one state? And in a razor thin national race, that's probably enough. Do no harm and give me one state.
Charles, are there lessons to be learned from the selections of, say, Dan Quayle or Sarah Palin or Tim Kaine? What was your take on where the vice presidential pick matters?
So in this election, I think the vice presidency really does matter. We clearly just saw how much it matters with Kamala now being the candidate for the 24 cycle. It does matter in the sense of the razor thin margins and scenarios from the past. For example, in 2000, in late July that year, there was a poll out in Pennsylvania that showed that had George W. Bush selected Tom Ridge, who was a very popular governor, a moderate Republican, had he selected Ridge, the polling indicated that they had a double-digit lead in the state. Bush, of course, went with Dick Cheney, and Bush lost Pennsylvania. And it wasn't until Trump in 2016 that Pennsylvania went into under the Republican fold. So in the electoral land of 1-point margins that defines Pennsylvania, and that is also the case in other swing states, it really does matter. And we really will see a scenario where both VP candidates, whether it's J.D. Vance from neighboring Ohio, or let's say the scenario of Josh Shapiro, if he is selected, or Mike Kelly, we don't know yet, they'll be planted here because they realize the importance of Pennsylvania.
Liz, America's favorite parlor game is who's going to be vice president. Certainly in Pennsylvania, the most important swing state. The issue is obviously heightened by the possibility that Pennsylvania Governor Josh Shapiro could be the pick of the Democrats. Do you think Josh Shapiro will be selected by Kamala Harris?
The signs are pointing to him being picked. That being said, anything can change, and I think he is the riskier pick. You know, it's crazy what happened with his candidate, the Democratic nominee for treasurer, but she's gotten a lot of headlines with her attacks against him, and the ads write themselves. But I think the real issue he has is, sadly, I think anti-Semitism is a big portion of, unfortunately, I think the Democratic Party. You see it on the streets, you see it on encampments. My cousin, for example, a young woman that works in New York City, and on Friday in an elevator in Manhattan, working for CVS, were two young women who really like Kamala and said, but you better not pick Josh Shapiro because he's anti-Hamas, not even, pro-Israel, Hamas. And I think that that's an actual very serious concern. So, somebody like Kelly, who I think appeals to the same kind of people that J.D. Vance appeals to. I think Josh Shapiro turns up the turnout in the southeastern part of Pennsylvania, but I'm not sure that Kamala wouldn't have it anyway, honestly. So I think the safer pick is Kelly, but from everything I'm hearing, it's going to be Shapiro.
Todd, to follow up on Liz's point, Aaron McClellan, the Democratic candidate for state treasurer, is not backing Shapiro in his campaign for VP. Obviously, Shapiro from Montgomery County brings a lot of name recognition in the southeastern corner, but he also has some issues that have been raised in his time in Harrisburg. Can you explain?
Well, obviously, the big one would be the Mike Verb scandal. And I think that I know that there are some national outlets that are in looking at how they can sort of advance this story if Shapiro should become the pick. You talk about his coming from the Southeast and so forth, and this resistance that he's getting from McClellan. I think this little spat with McClellan highlights one of the great accomplishments of Josh Shapiro that I think rarely gets talked about and probably doesn't get enough credit for. And that is, when he ran, he cleared the field in his party. And it was smooth as silk. I mean, there was no reporting that, 4 or 5 people had emerged from a smoky back room and a couple of them were bloodied. There were no reports of fights. And quite honestly, it's the kind of thing that it's the sort of thing that if it were at a national level, you'd get a really great 8,000-word magazine piece from Olivia Nuzzi about how did Josh Shapiro clear the field. But, you know, I think look, if you were making the case for him, I think that's a great reason why, because if you go back to Kamala Harris's 2020 campaign, and I'm not talking about the politics here, I'm talking about the logistics and the management. I mean, there were a lot of stories that just the basic sort of, you know, again, the logistics and the management, getting the gears to work together, that it was not smooth. And I think that's another kind of element that a Shapiro could bring to that ticket. And again, you know, the fact that that he had such unity when he ran is just, it's a huge plus in his favor in the whole selection question. I wait for Guy and Charles and everyone else to completely knock me down. Yeah, no.
We'll give Guy the first opportunity. Guy, whether it's Shapiro, whether it's Senator Mark Kelly from Arizona, whether it's North Carolina Governor Roy Cupper. I actually saw a video that it's an Eastern North Carolina pronunciation. It's Cupper, although he's fine with Cooper. Could it be one of those three? Who do you believe Harris will choose?
Well, first, I would say that, look, I may be the minority here. You know, Todd made some bold observations. Let me be. I don't think Josh Shapiro wants this. I think this is all calculated. I think this is all intentional. I think he's a very thoughtful, calculating, contrived planner. He is not ready for 2024. He does not want to go national yet. He wants to raise his profile in the media. He wants to raise his profile with donors. He wants the story to be told. The young, overwhelmingly popular governor from a swing state. He's gotten that story. It's a national story. His pictures on CNN and MSNBC and CBS News as potential running mates. If you look at it through that prism, he's done very well. There are the realities that Liz and Todd talked about. Look, every candidate has something. At some point, you fired somebody. At some point, you messed up. Yeah. I'll let the voters decide whether the whole verb thing was the catastrophe. I think it was on many levels, but the voters will decide. But I begin with that premise. I don't think he wants it. And I think the only way he becomes that is if the party leaders and the party donors tell him bluntly, there is no 28 if you're not helping us in 24. Okay. I think today it's Kelly of Arizona, because I believe that their first line of defense is protect Arizona. And I think that in Pennsylvania, they're going to rely on the suburbs and the Democratic machine to take care of Pennsylvania for Kamala, and that they don't need Shapiro. And the risk reward for Shapiro, because of his faith, is just not there. Kelly's the safer pick. Kelly probably locks down Arizona. And in the game of math, I think Kelly is the pick they go with for that very reason. There's low risk, low reward, and you lock in some electoral votes that otherwise would be at play.
Charles, what do you think about the former astronaut from Arizona versus the year-and-a-half long tenured chief executive of the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania?
So Mark Kelly has the perfect resume for suburbia when it comes to from being an astronaut, military service, son of cops, grew up in New Jersey. He is the guy that would be central casting for driving up the margins in the suburban region. And if abortion is on the ballot in Arizona, for example, that makes Arizona that much more in play with a native son running. So he would be more competitive in the Sun Belt, but he does have northeastern roots, so he can talk the talk here and drive up margins here as well, with the, as Guy noted, with the help of suburbia, but also the Democratic machine of Philadelphia. Shapiro, if he did not seek elected office, he could have another career as teaching master classes in public relations. He's masterful at it. Yep. And we just know this alone by the story of I-95. If you talk to any suburban voter who is not tuned in daily and you ask them, who is Josh Shapiro? The answer is, oh, that's the guy who fixed 95. He knows how to create tangible, relatable stories. He would be very competitive here, would drive up the margins. Let's keep in mind, I mean, the outcomes in these races come out to 70, 80,000 votes. And this past weekend alone shows where Shapiro would be competitive. He had a rally with Democratic officials and labor unions of Philadelphia on Friday night. Then he headed out to Cumberland County, had a rally there for Kamala. So those are the regions he will target, drive up the margins in the West Shore of Harrisburg, suburban Philadelphia, and do quite well in places like northeastern Pennsylvania, where he overperformed in 22. But lest we forget, he has had an incredibly successful career, has never lost a race. But this will be a test for him because it will put him on the defense, and he will face a far more formidable candidate compared to Doug Mastriano, who in 2022, let's face it, was a doomsday machine for all Republicans down ballot.
Sometimes stranger, more base instincts come over a voter, and I don't put a lot of stock in this, but it's pretty true that if you throw out the 2012 election of Barack Obama versus Mitt Romney, that in all the previous elections, the candidate with the better head of hair won. And so just there. And
Well, none of them have great hair.
Josh Shapiro has great hair. Josh Shapiro has
I don't know.
For a candidate
has great hair. You know, the thick, wavy kind of. But yeah, I don't. Well, we'll see.
Yeah. Sorry, I know it's a cheap point, but it was a bird in the saddle. I apologize.
Well, we'll give Liz the opportunity since you started all off. Who do you think that Kamala Harris will pick?
Well, as I said, I from what I'm hearing, it looks like it's going to be Shapiro. You see it on Axios. I have a twin sister who's very active in the national scene. She's hearing it's going to be Shapiro. But again, I think the safer pick is Kelly. And you're starting to see these news outlets coming after Shapiro. He's untested. That's the issue she deals with. He has never had a difficult race. He is untested. He does have, he may have had the I-95 plus, but he does have the Mike Verb scandal. And, you have the Senate president, first female Senate president, who's saying he swept it under the rug. And there's some real, and the fact is too, Mike Verb was a very big Trumper. So why was the governor protecting him? It's a head scratcher. But, so there's that issue. And you're seeing the progressives pushing against him, writing to Kamala saying, we don't like his stance on Israel. And you see some of the teachers unions and leaders coming out saying, we don't like his stance on school choice. But then you got the school choicers saying he didn't deliver, even though he promised us, and you saw it on Fox News. So there's a lot more angst going around his candidacy than you see with Kelly. So we'll see.
Let's wrap things up and get a few thoughts from each of you on the selection of J.D. Vance as Republican presidential candidate. Does he help or hurt the ticket? To start with you, Charles.
So J.D. Vance could absolutely help the ticket if he stays focused. So he really captures, let's say, the intellectual component of modern Trumpism. He in terms of the economic populism, he is the best pick in that sense. But he risks overplaying the hillbilly elegy shtick in the Appalachia background in a state like Pennsylvania, which working class voters here can't relate to that background. So if he stays focused on the underlying concerns among working class voters here, which continue to be finances amid inflation and immigration in regions like northeastern Pennsylvania, where that concern is shared by a cross-section of ancestral Democrats who are now trending Republican, but also Latino voters who are quite open to the Republican Party. If he works that crowd and stays focused rather than getting himself in situations of gaffes, as he has confronted in recent days, based on past recordings being released by and exploited by the Kamala campaign, he could be quite competitive or helpful to Trump in Pennsylvania.
Todd, your thoughts on J.D. Vance?
Yeah, Charles is right. It's basically a question of his willingness to be disciplined, and I think he very much understands that necessity, and that being disciplined is the first rule of adhering to the first rule of do no harm. And so I think he will do that. The only question is, and you could honestly say this of Mark Kelly and Josh Shapiro and JD Vance, really is, I always just wonder, after having sort of, at the time I was reporting in DC when the whole scandal broke over Ralph Northam's, this picture from a yearbook in which he was in blackface. People who have still only run statewide races, I still wonder, whether the media has truly excavated everything. And so, and look, Vance, kind of led a sort of pedestrian life, right? He wasn't really sort of an aspiring politico his whole life. So I put those chances kind of low, but still, I also wonder if there's not one more thing, like something that could drive the news cycle for 2 or 3 days, that might, one more skeleton like that in his closet.
Guy with a junior senator from Ohio help or hurt the ticket?
So to the points that Charles and Todd made, if we know most of what there is to be known, or almost all there is to be known, then he does no harm. And where he potentially does it, again, in this new era, I do not think we will see JD Vance any more than I think we'll see Vice President Harris's ultimate pick. This is not somebody who's going to crisscross America. This is somebody who's going to spend 90% of their time in the Rust Belt telling that story. I was born poor. Now, again, to Charles's point, I don't know that he should come to Ben Salem in Bucks County and talk about having been born in Appalachia, which, not everybody knows what that means if you're not from Western Pennsylvania. But if he talks about the American dream and how poor people and those needing a second chance, like his mom, need that second chance in America, if he talks about that and talks about what was the Trump message of 16, that working class folks need the ability to grow and things aren't working for them. If he stays disciplined and on message, he can be a plus. If we know everything there is to know about him, he will not be a negative. So far, I think he's close, and he'll only get better, assuming we know all we know. He'll have a message, he'll have an audience, and I suspect by September, he'll be very good at going to that audience and delivering that message. And folks in Pennsylvania, in Minnesota, and Wisconsin are going to see him a lot, and we'll get to see him probably up close here in Pennsylvania more than almost any other state.
Liz, we'll give you the final word.
I think it would have been nice if JD Vance was from a swing state. That I've heard people complain that, wow, I wish we picked somebody that was from a swing state. That being said, I listened to his VP speech. I listened to him do a long, his first interview after being chosen on Hannity. And he comes across very reasonable, and I've talked to a couple Democrats who didn't know anything about him, who listened to him. And, he's very reasonable. He's articulate. He's also comes across as a nice person, I think. And people that know him say he is. He's legitimately a solid person. And so I think that's something that Trump needs to have on the ticket. So ultimately, again, let's see if there's more of these incidences where he's talking about cats, ladies with cats or whatever. But if there isn't a lot to dig up on him, I think he will be very good. And that's why I say, Kelly might be the better pick for Harris, because I think the voters that are, those voters that are voting on the economics, who might have been Democratic voters before, are somebody that Vance can reach. I don't know that Josh Shapiro reaches them so much. He's really the suburbanite candidate. So there we go.
It's been a crazy 2 weeks, and our thanks to our roundtable for providing some insight to what has been going on over the last 14 days. Guy Ciarrocchi with the Commonwealth Foundation, Charles McElwee with RealClearPennsylvania, Liz Freed-Havey with the Dilworth Paxson Law Firm, and Todd Shepherd with Broad and Liberty. Thank you all for joining us on Voices of Reason.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And that will do it for today's edition of Voices of Reason. Our thanks to Allan Lichtman, creator of the 13 Keys to the White House Prediction Model, to Pollsters Berwood Yost from Franklin and Marshall, and Chris Borick from Muhlenberg College, and to our Powerhouse Roundtable, Guy Ciarrocchi from the Commonwealth Foundation, Charles McElwee from Real Clear, Pennsylvania, Liz Priade-Havey from Dilworth-Paxson, and Todd Shepherd from Broad and Liberty. For all of us with Voices of Reason, I'm Steve Ulrich. Thanks for listening.